Whitechapel is a district immediately to the east of the City of London, the historic core of London. So it has been built up for very many centuries through Whitechapel. The major road, Whitechapel Road, which is immediately behind me, has been the principal link from the City of London to all destinations to the east. So it's a very historically important road. Whitechapel has, for a long time, many centuries, been a place of commerce and of industry, very mixed but very productive, and it's also had a very dense population, a good deal of poverty, but we're going to concentrate on an aspect of the industrial history of the area. Whitechapel Bell Foundry is hugely interesting in its own right, but it's also really useful for us in the Survey of London to show the methods we use, the ways we as historians can combine looking at documents, paper archive, and indeed online archive, with close analysis of the building fabric, but also another aspect I'll come to at the end, oral history, talking to people. But before going into those separate aspects, I'll just sketch a little bit about the history of the foundry. Its origins are obscure, but it's been going since at least the 1570s, so 450 years, possibly another couple of hundred years longer than that. But it wasn't originally on this site. It was further west, nearer the City of London, in densely built up alleys in Whitechapel, near where habitation was in those centuries, 16th, 17th centuries. And in the 1730s, the principal bell founder, Thomas Lester, bought property in what was then much more open, less built up territory further east on the edges of Whitechapel to build a bigger foundry. And I should say at this point that the bell foundry was established for making church bells, some of which were very, very big metal castings. So it's a very intense manufacturing process, and has remained so over many centuries, but it needs space because some of these bells were of very large size. When we came to look at the history of this site, behind trees, but we'll go and investigate it a bit more closely, we saw that the received wisdom, repeated in many accounts of the history of the place, was that it was built in the 1730s, which is when Thomas Lester bought the site. He bought it in 1738. However, he didn't immediately build. It takes time to build a substantial premises like this. And the evidence that came out of contemporary newspapers and records of property ownership from the archives and taxation records, the sorts of sources that we use, made it very clear that the buildings here weren't standing up until the mid-1740s. The first firm date for them being present is 1746, which you may say is a very small difference, 1730s, 1740s, but in the Survey of London we're very keen to get these sorts of details correct. Looking closely at the building, we can use brickwork. They are mainly, almost entirely brick buildings, and brick is probably the most important building material in London historically before the 20th century. And there are also aspects of the use of wood that we can see on the building, in its walls, its windows, and so on. But to do that properly, we need to go to the building and see it up close. It is actually a house, or it's two houses at the front. The main house for the master founder, the smaller house on the corner is for the foreman, And behind were the Foundry buildings, the places where the bell making went on. And this house at the front is a very good quality but quite typical house for London of the 1740s. I'm wanting to look closely at the building, really just to show how the building itself gives us evidence about its time and its details and how it's. One feature I'm going to point out is the door case. This is found very frequently in 18th century and better quality 18th century London houses, and it's a neoclassical Doric door case from antiquity, Greece and Rome, and it is a useful dating tool, although not very precise. Another feature to draw attention to is the brickwork. It tells you many things. The colour of the brickwork is typical of the 18th century, but just to take one detail, here you see these very narrow, what are called closer bricks. They're put in to the bonding to allow the bricklayers to get a clean edge to a window. So where you see them, that means the window's always been there. If you look close to the base of this window, they're not there. That indicates that the windows once had a sill level here and that they've been altered to be larger. With the sash windows, timber sash windows, typical of 18th century London houses, are set well back from the wall. This was a legal requirement from the early 18th century in order to limit the spread of fire. Too much timber near the surface helped fire spread. So here we see what was expected by the law. I'm going to show you some things that will contrast as we walk around the building. There are some more details to consider. One thing here to notice is the shop front, which was inserted, an early 19th century alteration, very much repaired, has quite nice Greek fret detailing, another classical detail.
I was cool there.
Come round the corner, and here on the Fieldgate Street side of the building, there is another house, smaller house, that was built at much the same time, very probably for the foreman of the Foundry. And you'll notice that the windows here, timber sash windows, similar windows, are set flush with the wall, which was technically illegal at the time this was built, but people did it because there was no enforcement of the law. So that's a lesson. I mean, if something's illegal, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Another feature of this house is the door surround, which is made of timber but imitating stone, as if it's made of stone, and it's taken from a pattern book, a published book of guidance for decorative features on houses that was published by James Gibbs in 1732. So there again we've got interaction between the evidence of the building and documentary sources. This is a decade or so after the book was published, a bit of fashionable trim, but cheaply done in timber, not stone as would have been expected in a more expensive building. Okay, we're carrying on around the building towards the workshop buildings behind that have been reconstructed within, but still remain largely 18th century on the outside. And over here, set in the wall, is a little lettered plaque. It says, "This is Baines Street, 17-something-6. The date has been damaged. Baines Street was the original name of this street. It's been renamed since. It's named after Edward Baines, who died in 1766. So knowing that possibly the missing number is numeral is a 6, 1766. It didn't keep that name for very long. But obviously these sorts of inscriptions are evidence that need to be taken into account, but not necessarily believed, especially where you have problems like legibility. There are straight joints, or in this case a jagged joint, that give you building breaks, changes in the phases of building. here there was substantial repair in the 1960s, and this older brick on this side. A final point about the walls, the outer walls. This block, which was incorporated into the workshops in the 19th century, began as two small houses. And you can see this in the joints here. This was a doorway that the joints carry down, and the same is true of the answering opening. And these were once window openings that have been blocked. They only lasted houses for something like about 20 years, which is another thing we know from documentation. Now step back from the foundry, and we're on the east side with the workshop ranges behind us. We've come here, and I'm holding a booklet that we produced because we wouldn't normally do this, but we produced this booklet to show examples of how we have approached the history of the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, because it is currently a case of huge debate about what to do with the future of the foundry. It closed in 2017, and there have been years of discussion, and the issue is still unresolved in 2020. But I won't talk about that situation, but I will talk about how we tackled the history of the building in this context of contest or contestation. One important aspect of what we generally do is photographic recording, and our photographer Derek Kendall has made a detailed photographic record of the process of making bells, the founding, all of what went on inside the foundry while it was operative. Another is measured survey, where we produce plans, which plans are vital for explaining how complicated sites work. And my colleagues, Helen Jones and Amy Spencer, came here with the permission of the master founder, Arthur Hughes, in 2016 to set about making a measured survey, which is about 3 or 4 days' work in a site like this. And all was going well until the third day, where the master founder became very uncomfortable about our continuing presence on site, and I came to try to reassure him. On the fourth day of working on site, after a little bit of tension the previous day, Helen and Amy were evicted. They were told they could no longer work on site and had to leave, which was a bit upsetting and unexplained. We had no idea what was going on. We discovered a few months later, when the foundry closed, after nearly 500 years of continuous bell making, it stopped in 2017. It was obvious in retrospect that the master founder, Arthur Hughes, had been concerned that the work we were doing would somehow make the process of closing more difficult. It has been difficult in the sense that there has been controversy ever since about trying to keep some form of bell making going here. And in that context, the final thing I want to mention is another aspect of recording buildings and the life of buildings. It's really important, is oral history. In our booklet, my colleague Shahid Salim interviewed both the master founder, Arthur Hughes, and his foreman on site, Nigel Taylor, and long accounts of their lives working at Whitechapel Bell Foundry. So recent history, the last decades, is all set out. And what's really interesting is that the two accounts don't agree. They both have different views. So this is a really important lesson for oral history in particular, but for historical investigation in general. Your sources don't necessarily all say the same thing. You get contradiction, and you have to make judgments about what you repeat and what you amplify, and how much credibility you give to one source as opposed to another.
So the proposal for redeveloping the Bell Foundry was to turn it into a boutique hotel with a small bell making element on the ground floor, which was perceived by the campaigners against the proposal to really be a token gesture of continuing the sort of tradition of bell making on the site. And it wasn't really a working foundry, it wasn't an industrial facility in any way. It was described more as a kind of gift shop type. By the campaigners it was described as a kind of bell themed gift shop, essentially. So the campaign also had at its heart, it wasn't just about saying we don't want the redevelopment to take place, but the campaign also put forward a counter-proposal. And the counter-proposal was a scheme developed by the UK Historic Buildings Preservation Trust, and they put forward a proposal to maintain a manufacturing business on the site, and that would be manufacturing of art pieces, essentially fabrication of artworks for artists, which would be managed by an organisation called Foundry, who do that kind of work already. And it would include a working foundry and casting as part of the process that would be taking place on the site. So the counter-proposal, which was really quite a detailed scheme, which was prepared by the UK Historic Preservation Building Trust, was quite detailed, quite well worked out, and it was a fully detailed business plan as to how this could work. And Foundation are they run similar workshops in Spain, I think. They're a UK-based organisation, and the UK Historic Buildings Trust have a similar property that they have managed in the north of England somewhere. I can't remember exactly where it is. In a similar way, so they have kind of an ongoing manufacturing activity going on. So there was a viable counter-proposal that the campaigners were putting forward, as well as against the redevelopment of the boutique hotel. And the opposition hinged on this issue of what's called in planning terms optimum viable use. And the campaigners used this term to argue from a planning point of view, in terms of planning law, that the redevelopment of the foundry, or the change of use from a foundry to a hotel, was not valid because there was still a viable foundry business that could be maintained on the site. So the argument against the redevelopment was really about quite a specific point of planning law. It wasn't simply that we don't want to lose the foundry. And actually the campaign accepted the fact that the Bell Foundry in itself would no longer function on the site. But their aim was to maintain a working industrial premises on the site, even though, because it would be making different things, and through that to kind of probably to maintain the building fabric, maybe in a more sort of complete way as well. So it was a combination of use and fabric, which is what the opposition was based on. Now, I think the campaign was pretty successful in that the application for the boutique hotel went to planning. It went to a planning committee where the application would be decided on. The planning committee narrowly voted to approve the scheme, but then, because the planning process had not taken into account properly the number of opposition letters and the campaign against it, so there had been 20,000 letters or 20,000 signatories to a petition against the redevelopment internationally, and a 2,000 person petition locally in Tower Hamlets against the scheme, against this redevelopment, and it was felt that hadn't been taken into account in that planning process. So the planning permission, the decision was frozen, as it were, and it was taken into the Secretary of State. It was taken up by the Secretary of State, so referred to the Secretary of State, which basically now means it has to be heard again at a governmental level. And then the Secretary of State, so at governmental level, the decision will be made as to whether that redevelopment will be permitted or not. And that hearing is going to be in October of this year, and that's where we are now. Well, I've came to learn about the Bell Foundry when I was working with the survey on the Whitechapel project, and first interaction was when we interviewed Alan Hughes in the Bell Foundry and showed us around, and that was in early 2016. Then we didn't really have much. I didn't have much to do with the Bell Foundry until news came about it being sold, and then subsequent to that, there was news about the new buyer and the closure of the Bell Foundry. And the issue was that the buyer of the Bell Foundry was a developer who was going to develop it into a boutique hotel. So that caused some consternation in the local area. And then I got involved. I became aware of that through local history groups that wanted us as the Survey of London to get involved in campaigns to oppose the new conversion of the Bell Foundry to a hotel and the loss of the Bell Foundry. The organisation that led the opposition to the redevelopment of the Bell Foundry into the boutique hotel was called the East London Preservation Society, which is quite a well-established local history group in the area, campaigning for preservation of historic buildings and so on. And it was them alongside a local journalist, blogger, writer who goes by the name of The Gentle Author, and he has a very popular blog and publishes books, and his interest is in the kind of history of the East End. And it was really a coalition of the East London Preservation Society and The Gentle Author who came together to start to create this campaign against the redevelopment. So we, as the survey, myself and Peter went along to one of their meetings. In terms of, well, they invited us as the Survey of London to go along to one of their meetings, but Peter made clear at that meeting that as the survey, the survey itself couldn't get involved in the campaign because it wasn't really the role of the survey to be a campaigning organisation around issues of preservation of historic fabric. But we couldn't involve ourselves personally, in personal capacity. And interestingly, the Gentle Author asked Peter at the end of that meeting, I wonder what Ashby would have done. And I think that set Peter's cogs ticking. and then Peter thought, yeah, maybe not so much that the survey should have a role at campaigning, but you know, there could be ways in which the survey could make the story of the Bell Foundry more sort of known and prominent, and then that story is there for everybody to sort of to be able to sort of access. So the survey then published a small booklet on the Bell Foundry and its history, and we took some of the content from our interview with Alan Hughes and our interview with one of the founders, the master founder of Sutton. His name escapes me right now, but we interviewed him as well. So we took the transcripts of those plus the write-up of the Bell Foundry from the kind of that Peter had done, so the kind of historic, the kind of survey write-up of the Bell Foundry, and compiled it with some photographs and published a small booklet, and that could be distributed by the Gentle Author and by the East London Preservation Society to anyone who was interested. So in that way, the survey kind of didn't explicitly support the campaign, but it produced material that the campaign could use if they so wanted it. But that material was also publicly available, so anybody could have access to that. The resistance to this redevelopment, I think, came from a few different places, or a few different kind of motivations were driving it. One was this kind of awareness of the Bell Foundry being a very unique industrial heritage. So being one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuous manufacturing businesses in the country. One of the fewest, or if not last, surviving Bell Foundries. I think there's maybe two others in the country that are left. And also its role or its position as part of the kind of heritage of Whitechapel as well. So something that's really characterised Whitechapel. So the Whitechapel bells and the Whitechapel Bell Foundry is something that's obviously very well known. So it's a loss of all of these different things, alongside ongoing sort of what's called gentrification of Whitechapel more broadly. So on the one hand, it's the loss of a very particular kind of history, historic fabric, industrial history, which is very specific to the Bell Foundry. On the other hand, it's also a reaction against ongoing gentrification and redevelopment of an area like Whitechapel, which is broadly perceived, that kind of redevelopment is broadly understood as being not in the interests of local people. It was a combination of that was driving the kind of opposition. The Gentle Author and the East London Preservation Society then approached East London Mosque, who are, essentially neighbours to the Bell Foundry, to become involved in the campaign. So they sort of petitioned the mosque to oppose the redevelopment of the Bell Foundry. The mosque didn't really know about the development plans when the Gentle Author went to them. So I arranged the meeting between the Gentle Author and the mosque, for example, as part of, and again this is about having the role, that role really came through the work with the survey in Whitechapel, because through working on the histories of Whitechapel with the survey, we have built up a number of relationships in the area with a range of different organisations. So what's interesting, or different actors if you like, and what's interesting is that although there are a number of actors in Whitechapel, community organisations, religious organisations, writers and broadcasters and so on, each has a different interest, a different kind of interest in the area, but they don't often overlap. And as the survey, what we did, because of the nature of the work that we were doing, we sort of had made connections with a number of different groups. Arranged a meeting between the Gentle Author and the mosque, and he was really kind of petitioning the mosque to get involved in the campaign against the redevelopment of the Bell Foundry. And the mosque didn't really know about it up till that point, even though they had been consulted through the planning application. I think, you know, because it's quite a large organisation, and it probably would have been looked at as just another notification of any other planning application and not really looked at in given much attention to. So really when the Gentle Author told them about the whole scheme, that was the first that they were really actually taking note of what was going to be built there. Opposed the development on the grounds that it was going to be a hotel and a rooftop. I think there was a rooftop bar planned, so it was going to introduce a certain kind of nighttime activity and economy which they felt was not appropriate to activities that the mosque would be undertaking. And I think what happened is that the whole kind of idea of the history of the Bell Foundry and the significance of the Bell Foundry as a historic part of Whitechapel became a common narrative that different groups could coalesce around, even though it might not have necessarily been their initial impetus for opposition. So through the mosque, through that widening of the campaign, some local councillors also got involved as campaigners against the redevelopment. And my feeling, and they were councillors who are Bangladeshi origin, or Bangladeshi background, and so they were connected to the mosque as well as to local politics. And although they were very enthusiastic about the history of the Bell Foundry and the significance of the Bell Foundry in Whitechapel, they were also, I think there was also a political element, meaning a sort of ideological element about the gentrification and redevelopment of Whitechapel. So I think with some of them, I wouldn't say with all of them, or this was a kind of blanket case, but I think with some of them there was a kind of overlapping interests. One was about Whitechapel, the historic significance of the Bell Foundry, but also that was combined with ongoing redevelopment and gentrification of Whitechapel, which was leaving out local people. So and then there was an interesting campaigning meeting that we had in the mosque, where I spoke at that meeting. And I spoke in a personal capacity, and I have to make that clear in the meeting that although I had worked on the Survey of London's project, I wasn't speaking as a part of the survey, but I was speaking in a personal capacity, but coming with the knowledge of the project that I'd done with the survey. So it's interesting having to make those distinctions quite carefully between the roles that I was playing. And I spoke for a few minutes at that meeting and just talked about the kind of the role of the Bell Foundry in Whitechapel, the history of the Bell Foundry, and its kind of specific, its significant industrial history, and so on. And at that meeting, it was held in the mosque, and it was largely people from and sort of constituencies of the East London Preservation Society, so their members and people in their kind of circle of people who are involved in their campaigns and so on. So it was quite a different demographic that would normally go into the mosque, for example. So it was really this coming together of really quite different aspects of what makes up kind of interests around Whitechapel. And it's interesting that it's a building, and it's the history of the building, and it's the potential redevelopment of the building that created these new social connections in the area.